Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to speak about this beautiful little Glycine which I acquired a few weeks ago now, and which I've been enjoying ever since. And it's a piece which I've had various problems with regards to the movement and some teething problems with some parts which didn't quite work correctly. But through those I've been able to learn a great deal about repairing a vintage watch, and indeed about really how mechanical movement works from a mechanical perspective, which is something which I don't often get the chance to look into, and which has been a real pleasure. And of course I've had to change a few parts, but certainly it's a beautiful piece which is very representative of Glycine in the 1970s in terms of their designs and the beauty of their products. And as you can see, I've got on this little pillow, which was very kindly sent in by a viewer who runs a company called Watch Mama, which is a company that makes pillows for watches to be placed on in boxes and so on. And he was very kind to send me this very attractive little pillow with coral and a rather fitting turtle, as you can see, which does go very nicely, I think, with this little dive watch. So I'll include a link down below if you'd like to have a look at those, because I'm not being paid in any way to say this, but it was very kind of him to send it in, and I think only right for me to send anyone who's interested in that direction. However, before I begin the video, I would of course like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is the group I run on Snups, which is a social media platform really where you can share pictures of your collections and your interests, and where indeed you can discuss matters of horology with myself and other enthusiasts to really be able to enjoy in the community of us watch lovers. And for today's featured picture from the group, we have QBK's beautiful shot of a Steinhardt Ocean 500 titanium, which is a great-looking alternative to the Ocean 1 from Steinhardt in the titanium finish, and indeed with a very, very high legibility dial and bezel. And if you would like to join the group, then do follow the link down below to be able to take a look and join if you like. I bought this watch a few weeks ago now, and I must say I've been enjoying it ever since. And for a few months I've been looking for example, an Omega Speedmaster Mark II. But in light of the service prices of those, and indeed the fact that I'd like to save up a bit at the moment, to see really where that takes me in a few months, I thought that this would be an interesting piece. And I bought it from eBay, and of course eBay is one of those places where you do have to be careful with regards to choosing a seller who you trust, and I found a really brilliant one with regards to this watch, who helped me immensely with various issues I had with the timepiece. And when I was looking for a watch, I was looking for a stainless steel piece, really. Because of course steel is one of those materials that doesn't have the problem of plating or chroming, where that comes off over time. But the story of this watch, despite this watch being made in the early 1970s, starts really in 1914, when Glycine were founded and started producing dress watches for a number of consumers. And in 1931 the brand then went on to make automatic watches, and from then on they continued to progress through the 1940s. However, the 50s are when this brand really came into their own, because in the early 50s they came up with their own waterproof cases, the vacuum cases, which have become very collectible in fact, and have an interesting design which is very much of that era, with syringe hands which are filled, as well as a style of case which is dust resistant as well as water resistant, to provide a certain resistance to the elements which otherwise wouldn't have been present. But I think the greatest and most well-known aspect of Glycine as a brand is their creation of timepieces under the Airman range. And the Airman was, I think, a direct product of that era. This was an era with the newfound introduction of jets, for example, the de Havilland Comet, and indeed later in the 1960s you have the Concorde. But then similarly you have the wars, the Vietnam War later on in the 1960s and 70s, and then of course the Korean War in the early 50s. And this watch was very much central to that use during those campaigns, as it was a GMT pilot's watch with an external rotating bezel so that a pilot could very quickly keep track of time zones, which was really crucial to that era. And so as a result, you have watches from that era which have become very collectible. But this is a very different area of Glycine, or Glycine, because this watch, though it was advertised as a watch from the 60s, is in fact something from the 70s due to its movement choice. And this is a piece which follows the style of that era as well, which was different from the long, elongated tonneau style of cases seen from, for instance, Omega, having mentioned them before, and instead has this more stout form. And the case is 38mm square, so 38mm from here to here, and 38mm across, excluding the crown. And this is rather an interesting aspect of this watch, because when one looks at it, these large bevels conceal that fact, but you do have these brushed areas along the top of the watch, as well as polished sections along these edges. And when I chose the watch, I was extremely pleased to see the fact that all the lines are virtually untouched and remain very crisp, because one often sees a lot of watches with tonneau-style cases of this era, where over-polishing over the years has led to completely polished cases without these distinct divisions across the stainless steel. And this watch doesn't have any crown guards, as you can see, surrounding this crown. And the crown of the watch is part of the watch which I was a tad concerned about, and which I may well have replaced in future for a stainless steel equivalent. Because this style of crown is very much typical of the mid-century ISO internal threading crowns. And that's to say, when you unscrew the crown, because this does have a 200-metre water-resistant case, or at least back in its original day, when one unscrews the crown, you can see that it's a plated crown, and the crown tube doesn't have any visible threading. And the reason for that is that this has an internally threaded crown, and you can get hold of replacements for these from a number of sellers in order to be able to put in a new stainless steel version. But thankfully, because this is a very generic ISO crown for that period, you can get hold of replacements, which is an area where I think it's great when buying a vintage watch to look out for watches where you can find replacement parts. Obviously not to get rid of the originals, but if you intend to wear it every day, it can be nice to have parts which are of higher quality, or indeed in better condition. Now, for me, this watch's really striking beauty is placed very much upon the way this watch is so typical of its era. And the reason why I say this is because during that period, crystals, for instance, were very different. Nowadays, I think we're all very accustomed to flat and slightly domed crystals. But back then, due to the fact that usually one used acrylic or plexiglass crystals, you have these immense steps on the crystals from these box crystals, which protrude beautifully from the surface of the watch, and provide this fantastic refraction of light, which gives a look which is much more soft than a modern sapphire. You also get these very gentle and organic curves, which I think look absolutely wonderful, and I'm more than happy to have a more scratch-prone crystal in order to have this softer aesthetic, which I think works wonderfully with the design of the timepiece. And, of course, this does add a certain degree to the thickness of the watch, because the watch itself is only 10mm thick if you exclude the crystal, but does go up to just under 13 if you do include that protrusion. And then, of course, one has this bezel, which, due to the era, is bidirectional, as you can see, and has seen a certain amount of wear, as you can see, and would originally have had a fully PVD-coated rim in black, but that has worn off to some degree. Though that said, the condition of the insert in black is really excellent, and has been sustained, I imagine, due to the fact that it's very much flush with the case here, and also by that heavily protruding crystal, which means there's actually very little that could actually access that surface there and damage the surface paint. The dial is a very simple Glycine affair and very typical of this era, because we see a matte black painted dial, as you can see, with a simple printed Glycine logo, which has the old style of logo, which is no longer the winged style which we see today, but rather now has this simple crown. It also does state on the dial 20 atmospheres and automatic, as this was a dive watch of that era, and did feature a movement which was the ETA 2783, which I'll talk about in more detail, because it's a very interesting movement, and one which is often overlooked, but in my eyes has certain areas which I find particularly interesting. And then the condition rather of the dial is excellent. There are no particular signs of any sort of refinishing, which is something I appreciate, as it's very easy to get hold of a watch which has been refinished. But the surface detail and finishing is still excellent, and with a few small marks, notably, for example, up here. But otherwise, it's in very, very good condition, which was a real selling point for me with regards to this dial, and doesn't seem to have been touched. Then, of course, one has the indices, which have tarnished, as you can see, and used to have tritium lume plots. There doesn't appear to be any sort of glow coming from the watch anymore, well, perhaps the very faintest of glows after all these years, but nothing that can easily be seen properly. And then, of course, the hands are these straight painted hands with a white tip, which appear to be era correct, having checked from various pictures and sources to get a really good idea of this timepiece. But certainly, it's a beautiful piece, especially the second hand, where half of it has been painted white, whilst the counterbalance remains black to remove the visual emphasis of that side of the hand. Then the date wheel is still white, as per the movement, but has this sloped window with a painted white box around it, which again makes this watch reminiscent of something like a Seamaster 300, thanks to the utilitarian black and white styling, but without the clunkiness, say, which is often seen in 1970s designs, as this does remain very 60s inspired. Now, the case design of this watch is something which really did drag me in, because it's a design which I haven't seen from any other brands other than Glycine. And during this era, they were very keen on producing these tonneau style of cases, but with a much more restrained and reserved style than other 70s watches. And this watch was from the early 70s, but nonetheless the influence was very much felt throughout the watch industry, with the aforementioned Speedmaster Mark II, for example, featuring that style of case. And during this period they produced both versions with hooded lugs, as this watch has, where there are no two separate lugs, but rather there's a covering over the centre, and also various integrated lug models where there's simply a gap to attach a bracelet, rather than a full strap. And this features a beautiful, beautiful design in my eyes, being only about 10mm thick, or about 13 to the top of the crystal. And the 38mm square shape means that it actually wears extremely well on the wrist, as the strap can hang down, as you can see, and provide you with a real degree of comfort. And I do love this aspect of the vintage market, because of course you can look for something that really suits your taste without the constraints of what's currently produced. And the movement inside this watch is another interesting area, which I was not terribly well versed on. Despite having owned various vintage ETAs, I really looked into it for this watch, which I'm very pleased I did, because I found some very interesting aspects of this movement. And this movement was the ETA 2783. And the 2783 was produced from the 24 line of ETA movements as a sort of a successor to that range in the early 1970s. And so that would point to this watch being produced during that era rather than the 1960s, as I'd previously thought. And the movement itself is a very similar architecture to a modern ETA. It has typical characteristics which draw the eye to it, such as the automatic winding system and the area for regulation does appear very similar in its design, though is distinct from the modern movements. And of course, the build of this movement shows a genuine evolution for the ETA 2824, which is the direct successor to this movement. And as you can see, the beat rate on this watch is lower at 21,600 beats per hour, rather than the higher beat rate of 4 Hz, which is 28,800 on the modern 2824. Also, this watch doesn't hack, so when you pull the crown out, the seconds don't stop, but rather continue on their path. So these are areas where this movement is inferior, but I found some of the designs and characteristics very interesting, because in its era this movement was designed to be a general purpose movement. But it is rather interesting the fact that this movement does still provide double-way winding, so the rotor can spin both ways and still wind the watch. It does also feature somewhat more crude areas, such as the fact that when you try and manually wind the watch, it disconnects the rotor and so it spins around fairly freely, which some have described as a rather crude method of doing so. But in my eyes it still shows a degree of an interesting development which remains with ETAs to this day, which is still very curious in my eyes. The characteristics of this movement appear also very similar to previous ETA designs, where, for example, the balance wheel, which is situated around the 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock position, depending on which part you're looking at, provides a very accurate run, which is more accurate than I would have thought, especially for a watch of this age. But they've been able to achieve this with a particularly large balance wheel, which actually is almost the half the diameter of the movement, which is an interesting move and provides a great deal of accuracy, even at this age. And I did have a few teething problems with this watch originally, which had a certain implication with regards to having a look at the movement in more detail than I would previously have. And the issue was that the rotor, which of course sits behind the case back, was loose on its central axis, and so was hitting the case back and indeed the bridges of the movement. And it was very clear actually at this stage that the issue with that, after having a look at it and having a read into this situation, was down to the fact that the bearings at the centre of the rotor were worn out and damaged. And so as a result, I ordered a new old stock rotor, which was very kindly paid for by the seller, Orange Clockwork 007, who has a very good reputation on eBay and has certainly impressed me with this watch. And the rotor was very easily installed with a central screw which holds the rotor in place on these watches, as unlike modern rotors, they're not actually ball bearing held, but rather are entirely held by the attachment via a screw. And these are areas which I didn't think I'd have to look into with this watch, but it's been very interesting to learn what I've been able to learn from a vintage timepiece like this, and really get an idea of areas which I hadn't previously considered about movements, and indeed about what one needs to know as a watch collector. And there are areas which in future I think I might change about this watch. For example, the crown, which is a chrome-plated crown, which is, as you can see, somewhat chipped, and is rather interestingly an ISO crown, as I've mentioned. So it's a generic style of crown, which was very prevalent in that era as far as screw-down crowns went, with an internal threading. And you can get hold of these in steel, which is something I will do in future to try and make this watch a better everyday timepiece. And in truth, what this watch has shown me is something which is very different to someone who often enjoys new watches, or indeed just used timepieces. Because though I talk about vintage watches a great deal, and I've owned some in the past, owning this watch and being able to make the developments and changes to it myself, such as the new rotor, whilst of course keeping the original parts, has taught me a lot about the way these watches work, and indeed about what we as watch enthusiasts enjoy. Because it's true that the patina on this watch, for example, and the small marks that one sees on the case, and indeed the movement and the dial, are all very charming and characterful, and for roughly the £500 which this watch originally cost me, I considered other options on the market, just out of sheer curiosity, such as a Steinhardt or for a bit more Esquale. And it's always difficult to come back to the debate, because this watch offers, in many ways, functionality which is inferior to those watches. But in my eyes, it offers more. It offers a project over time, and it offers enjoyment, which I think many watch enthusiasts have come to love about vintage timepieces. The fact they offer something which no one else can get hold of new. The fact that these are very much watches you can find and enjoy for yourself through the developments, the services, and the repairs that you'll have to do over time to keep them in the particular condition you want. And so I'd be very interested to hear in the comments down below what you think of this watch and about this design, because it surely is a piece which is very different to others on the market. But I would be curious to hear what you think. Also, I'd be curious to hear what you think about, for example, changing parts yourself, if you can figure out how, and indeed sourcing parts yourself on the market. Because this is something which is debated. A lot of people would prefer to go to a watchmaker, but in my eyes, for a small repair which is easily done, I'd rather simply do it myself. And so if you enjoyed the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm the Watch Guy, over and out.